Good morning, everyone. First of all, I want to thank The Real Truth About Health for having me to this conference. This annual conference is a great gathering of a lot of different people with all types of specialties. And I also want to thank those of you who on a Saturday morning have made the effort to actually tune in and listen to what I have to say this morning. There are a lot of people talking over this 10-day conference. This is Saturday. It's early in the morning for a lot. I see from some of you who have signed in that we have people from as diverse as from Kansas City to France. So I'm welcoming people on a couple of continents here, and I'm grateful for that. You are, by the very fact that you are attending this conference, people who are already interested in health, your own personal health, the decisions that you make. You are informed consumers. And what I've done as an investigative reporter for the past 5 years, together with my wife, Trisha, who's also a writer, is we've done a deep dive into the American pharmaceutical industry. We've sort of looked into the history of what made the drug industry that we know today, that industry. Where were the pitfalls along the way? How did it get here in this unwieldy, at times insidious industry that often seems to be working against the public good as opposed to for cures and health? And that's been a process. It was during this period in trying to lay out this history, and that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit this morning. In the end, I have an 800-page book. 300 pages of it are source notes and footnotes. So I knew that the pharmaceutical industry would be coming after me and saying, by the way, how did you know that's right? What do you mean there's greed? What do you mean things are overpriced? What are you saying there about orphan drugs? So I wanted to make sure that I had original source notes for everything as I went through. And that's provided. But it's a comprehensive history. Today, I'm going to give you some of the highlights from the early days to the current period. This is my high-tech way of talking. It's a series of little note cards that I refer back to. So when we finish that, and I won't talk for that long, then we'll have quite a period of time for questions and answers. You may have things to ask totally separate from what I've discussed, and I'm happy to answer them to the extent that I can. The idea for this book, by the way, actually came up in the 1990s. I was talking to another investigative reporter, a fellow called Jim Phelan. He had unmasked the hoax that was at the time Clifford Irving's hoax autobiography of Howard Hughes. Some of you may recall that. And we were talking about investigative journalism in general. And I asked him, he was then in his 80s, what would you do if you were doing another book? And he said, I would do one about the drug industry, no question about it. It's like throwing a dart at a board. You're going to hit a good story. There's so much to tell. That sat in the back of my mind. And a lot of books came up along the way, as you heard. Finally got a chance to turn to this full time. After I finished a book in 2015 on the history of the finances of the Vatican, able to turn to this. And this has been sort of the project for the past 5 years. It was published on March 10th of 2020, the day before the World Health Organization declared coronavirus a pandemic. And although the second to last chapter in this book is called The Coming Pandemic, COVID is not mentioned in the book. It wasn't then out at the time that I had finished it. But I talk about coming pandemics and what drug companies hope to be able to, how they deal with them and how they are profit streams for them in the future. So I'm very proud of this book, by the way, as a sidelight. Not only did you hear Ben say before from the New York Times that it reads like an encyclopedic indictment of the pharmaceutical industry, a pharmaceutical version of Cops and Robbers, but other reviews from Pittsburgh Post-Gazette to the Washington Standard talk about this as an encyclopedic and compelling and enraging expose of the drug industry. Just a week ago, the Florida Book Awards, which gives awards to Florida-based authors, I'm based in South Florida, gave it the Best General Nonfiction Book Award of 2020. And the Society of American Journalists and Editors shortlisted it for the Best Business Book of 2020. I wasn't sure how it would be received because it is an in-depth, I try to be balanced in this take on the drug industry by covering the things that have been good that have come out of labs at times, and we can talk about some of those, versus the greed in the boardroom and in marketing. But it seems that the the things that they do that are nefarious are the ones we often remember because there are so many of them. For those of you, some of you may be familiar with it and others may not, but the origins of the American drug industry actually go back to addictive drugs in the middle of the 1800s, at a time when there were no rules. It's the wild west of drugs. I live in Miami, and here you'll often hear people say the cocaine cowboy days, the craziest days of the drug dealers in South Florida. I call the period up through the mid 1800s into the early 1900s, the cocaine cowboy days of the drug industry, because they were literally often cocaine. Everything went: cannabis, cocaine, heroin, morphine, opium, you name it. You could put it together into any remedy you wanted. They were marketed as so-called patent drugs, cure-alls, snake oil salesmen. You didn't have to prove that anything was safe. You didn't have to prove that anything was effective. You didn't even have to list what was on the label. And things were sold that became quite famous over a period of time. One of the most popular drugs of the time, something called the king of baby smoothers, that company was very clever. They looked through newspapers to see birth announcements. Then they would send a free copy of what they called the great baby smoother. It would make sure that your baby slept through the night and didn't bother anyone. Turns out that was about a third pure opium. After a while, when a number of babies started to die, there was an outcry in the market. It was taken off the market voluntarily by the people that had put it on and already made $1 million. The Sears and Roebuck was the catalog that I guess was the Amazon of its day. For $1.50, you could go ahead and order a vial of pure cocaine and a syringe. So that's the world that the American drug industry first comes into. And what it comes into at that time, by the way, is a boom for morphine and painkillers caused as a result of the Civil War. There's this tremendous demand. And so a couple of German cousins in Brooklyn, Charles Pfizer and his cousin, decide, hey, that looks like a pretty good business. They open up a factory in Brooklyn. They start to manufacture morphine with $2,500 in their own savings. Two pharmacist brothers in Philadelphia, John and Frank Wyeth, think, yeah, it looks like a pretty good industry, and they get into it as well. A naval wartime surgeon who saw firsthand that the morphine that arrived at the front lines was often adulterated and wasn't of good quality, thought he could manufacture better quality morphine. Edward Robinson Squibb was his name. A Union Army colonel thought the same thing. His name was Eli Lilly. Harvey Park and George Davis, one was an investor and one was a 27-year-old salesman. They formed Park Davis at the same time. And Burroughs Wellcome comes from two fellows, Silas Burroughs and Henry Wellcome, who decided that the American pharmaceutical business is so crowded by that time with all these newcomers, they're actually moving over to London, which they do. This is a period, by the way, when there are not just the name brands that we think of as the American companies that form, you hear those names, but the German companies that already existed. And one of the biggest was Bayer. Bayer had existed for hundreds of years, starting as a small chemical company and then had started to produce cures. They had a research lab. So Bayer comes up with, inside their labs, 4 different categories of drugs over a 5-year period. Drugs that will change the industry in some ways. Remember, at this time, you need no prescription. You're over the age of 18, you can go into any store that sells any of these remedies and be able to buy them. Here's what Bayer does. Starting, in 1897, inside their lab, they discover acetaminophen, which we know as Tylenol, paracetamol for those of you often in the EU and in the UK. So in 1898, the very same team discovers aspirin, a wonder drug, remarkable, and they market it as, under that trade name as aspirin. As a matter of fact, named after the head of that particular team was a devout Catholic and named it after a Saint Aspirin of Avila, which was a saint who was supposed to help cure headaches. In 1900, just a couple of years later, Bayer comes up with a new product called heroin. They actually trademarked the name heroin after the German name Heroisch for heroic, and they market heroin not only as good for children to soothe coughs and quiet children, but as a cure for morphine addiction, because morphine was what nobody had a patent on, was becoming an addictive problem. So they said, oh, heroin will get you off of morphine. Well, it will to some extent, but with not very good side results because it's a new type of addiction. And 3 years later, in 1903, they finished this cycle of drug discovery. Bayer discovers the entire class of barbiturates. Their particular brand is phenobarbital, but they develop barbiturates as a class. So now think of this. They have four major drug discoveries. They have barbiturates, heroin, aspirin, and acetaminophen. And guess which one Bayer decided not to put to the market because inside their lab, they had determined it was too dangerous. Acetaminophen, Tylenol. Hard to imagine, but true. Tylenol they thought was too dangerous, but they put heroin up, they put barbiturates up. No prescription required. You could go in and you could buy them at any time, and aspirin as well. All of these free drugs led to pushback. And there was an effort, especially with a fellow called Harvey Washington Wiley. He's a great story, and I have a chapter about him. He's the son of an itinerant revivalist Christian preacher. He comes from a very sort of simple background, born into a log cabin, and he comes to Washington into this wide-eyed idealism. And they make him the head of the Bureau of Chemistry. They make him the head of the Bureau of Chemistry because he's talking about dealing with additives and preservatives added in food because there are no rules regulating in them. He's convinced that a lot of them, like formaldehyde to keep beef and other types of mercury items to keep fish, would be dangerous. So they said, okay, run the Bureau of Chemistry, because nobody cared about the Bureau of Chemistry. It wasn't very important. It literally just had a handful of workers in it. So what he does is he becomes sort of the protagonist for, I want a federal rule about food and safety. And those food and safety rules really also then overlap into drug rules. So he leads the effort. He gets rebuffed by Congress for a number of times. He creates a thing. I have a chapter called, the Poison Squad. Poison Squad is an amazing, it's the first, I guess, in some ways, it's the first real life reality show. Although it wasn't on television, there was no TV, but it was covered wildly in the press and became a famous thing. He had a dozen volunteers. They would dress up in formal wear every evening, and he would feed them an assortment of food that he had made in a kitchen in the basement of the Bureau of Chemistry. And then he would add different additives and preservatives to it and not tell them what was in it, and see which one of those volunteers got sick over time, which one developed health problems. It was his live ongoing study. Eventually, when one died, that study was stopped. But I will tell you, it was an experiment that helped him eventually get a law together that passed Congress in 1906 called the Pure Food and Drugs Act. And what pushed it over, it's the first federal regulation about drugs in America and about food. What pushed it over the top is you have Harvey Washington Wiley leading this crusade. And then you have, by coincidence, Upton Sinclair, one of the great muckrakers of his time, puts out a book called The Jungle. And although it was a novel, there are 15 stomach-wrenching pages in it about the meatpacking industry in Chicago, and it led to an outrage in Congress. So it forced them to finally pass this legislation.